Bernanke bailout, part 2 and last part. This is really on government activism, on political activism in reaching a solution. In 1962, the U.S. had high unemployment. There had been chronically high unemployment in the 1950s, a reasonably prosperous period, but high unemployment, chronically high. And when the Kennedy administration came in, there was, I believe, 7% unemployment. And Kennedy ran on the idea of a tax cut that would be funded by government borrowing temporarily, but which would stimulate output and income, provide people with incomes and businesses with opportunities to invest in plant and equipment in order to meet the demand of consumers. There was even an investment tax credit to encourage modernization of American industry. So this was an activist tax plan. And the notion of using deficit spending, which has reached psychotic proportions in recent years, was very controversial then. And the magnitude of it was relatively small. Now, when you're getting increases in spending, there's an opportunity for organized labor in negotiating with highly concentrated oligopolistic industries, like at that time, the steel industry, the automobile industry, the oil industry. There's an opportunity for strong unions to get large wage increases. The union workers constituted a much larger percentage of the workforce in 1962 than in 2008. And they worked primarily in industries that were very, very profitable because they were capital intensive. You work on a refinery, most of the cost of the refinery is not labor. Therefore, you can give labor a good wage because they have a lot of equipment to work with and they're very productive. And most of your expense is crude oil and equipment and such as that, transportation. Same thing in the steel industry. The steel industry was a cartel. All the steel companies followed the price lead of U.S. Steel. If U.S. Steel raised prices and other steel companies didn't raise prices immediately after, U.S. Steel would punish them by reducing prices below cost and driving them out of business. That's how price discipline was maintained in a cartel. So the Kennedy administration, in order to make sure that when the tax cut hit and there was rising spending, it wouldn't be absorbed by inflation, because if the spending caused rising prices, then the Federal Reserve at the time would simply have tightened the money supply, created higher interest rates, and choked off the effect of the tax cut. So it was important to do something to prevent inflation. And so what the Kennedy administration did was basically to quietly reach a deal with the United Steelworkers. And they agreed to restrain their demands for wages. If the tax cut was successful and we got economic growth, there would be more jobs in their industry. And there would be higher incomes, even without higher wage rates. And following the negotiations, which were restrained, U.S. Steel pushed up prices, disregarding the concerns of the U.S. government, in order to take advantage of, one, not having to give away higher wages and yet being able to push up profits. And of course they had control, because they were the low-cost producer. They get rid of any competitor who didn't go along. The way Kennedy responded to this was to very openly become furious. So U.S. Steel raised prices, Bethlehem raised prices, the largest steel companies all raised prices within 24 hours. Kennedy said in public statements, my father always told me that businessmen were sons of bitches. And then said that he had instructed the Attorney General, his brother, to begin looking into antitrust proceedings against the major steel companies, and that he'd informed the Defense Department that they should consider buying from steel companies that don't go along with the price increases. Now this is real activism. I mean, they wanted a policy. It was a fair policy. They were trying to get some economic growth, and the steel monopoly screwed them, and he was going to screw them back. And then, after a couple of days, Inland Steel, maybe the 6th largest U.S. steel producer, and we didn't have a lot of imported steel then. Most steel in the U.S. was produced in the U.S., and the U.S. automobile industry was a very important industry at the time. Inland Steel announced that they were not going along with the price increase. And at that point, all the other steel companies rescinded their price increase. So, this is activism. This is somebody, and when Kennedy made this announcement, he said, I think this is in the public interest, and if the public doesn't agree with me, then I suggest that they secure the services of another president. Well, it was actually a pretty popular move. I don't see that today. This is not somebody getting ahead of the curve. This is somebody going out and bailing out people that the Treasury knew were in trouble long before, and apparently just didn't care. So, I would suggest that considerations now ought to be trying to prevent preventable foreclosures. Not all foreclosures, but some where they can be worked out, because the social cost of large numbers of foreclosures are different. On my street, I mean, I live in a shanty town, but if there's a foreclosure on this street, nothing bad's going to happen. There was a foreclosure down at the end of the block. Somebody bought it. Now they refurbished it. They'll put it on the market. But there are towns and neighborhoods where foreclosures create enormous crime and also push down the value of houses that people have actually invested in and have paid for and deserve to live there. So the social costs of the things that should be considered. This is not charity. On my street, it would be charity. And the notion of setting up a public lending agency like FHA to renegotiate some loans, to provide incentives, as Sheila Bair of FDIC said, so that servicers will consider things other than foreclosure. Right now, all the incentives are for foreclosure, because they could get sued by whoever owns the mortgage, which could be in Dubai. So, this is the conclusion of a two-part thing on activism.